Jordan had no idea what he started losing first: his money, his confidence, or himself. At that time, he still believed everything was just a temporary rough patch, like a strong wind that would eventually pass. He didn't know this was only the opening act of a fall he wasn't prepared for. Jordan was in his early 30s, tall, fit, carrying the confident energy of someone who had climbed up on his own. He grew up in a working-class family with no privileges and no one opening doors for him in the interior design world. Everything he achieved came from non-stop effort, studying late, taking extra jobs, accepting small, low-budget projects just to build a reputation. Thanks to that persistence, he opened a small, tidy studio specializing in designs for restaurants, offices, and a few creative renovation projects. Jordan used to be the kind of person everyone believed had a bright future. Creative, focused, good at talking to clients, and always quick with solutions. He was decisive, sometimes a little too confident, convinced that if today was good, tomorrow would be even better. Jordan's life before the crisis wasn't luxurious, but it was something he was proud of. He lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood, in a small apartment he had renovated himself. The car he drove every day wasn't expensive, but it was meaningful and tied to memories from his early career. He liked the feeling of being in control of everything, from his work schedule to every design he created. On the surface, Jordan's social circle looked pretty wide. He knew plenty of people in the industry and had even been recommended by a few restaurant owners to their friends. But he was too busy to maintain any truly deep connection. Whenever friends asked to meet up, he usually said, "Let me finish this project first." Then one project led to another. Slowly, distance formed without him noticing. Back then, Jordan was an optimist. He had a strong belief in the future and in his own abilities. But the cost of constant busyness was that he drifted farther and farther from his own emotions. He couldn't remember the last time he sat still for even a moment. All he knew was running, building, expanding, and hoping everything would keep moving upward. Then the market started to shift. Material prices shot up. Some clients put their projects on hold because they didn't want to take risks. Two major contracts Jordan had waited on for months were suddenly canceled. His key employee, the one who had been with the studio since the early days, quit out of fear for an uncertain future. Jordan reacted on instinct, tried to save everything. He started looking for new clients, taking on riskier projects, running everywhere just to keep the studio from slipping towards shutdown. But the harder he tried, the more drained he became. He slept late, ate at random hours. Some mornings he woke up, looked in the mirror, and saw a version of himself that seemed completely lost. The stress wore him down piece by piece. Calls from suppliers, from clients demanding updates, from the bank reminding him of payment deadlines. Yet each one felt like another small cut to his confidence. Then came an especially brutal week. The Treasury office notified him that his business account balance had dropped to a number that froze him in place. It was far too low to cover the next month's expenses. Before he could figure out a plan, a major client he had hoped would be his lifeline sent an email canceling the project for good after multiple delays. As if that wasn't enough, Jordan received another warning letter from the office building. If he didn't pay on time, he would be forced to move out. The studio he had built with years of effort was now at risk of disappearing simply because he could no longer hold it together. Jordan knew he was falling, but he didn't want to admit it. He was scared of being seen as a failure. Scared people around him would think all his past success had just been temporary luck. That fear pushed him to stay at the office late into the night. He sat alone in the dark, staring at unfinished designs, not because he still had the energy to work, but because he wanted to hold on to the feeling that he still had control over something. He sat there, surrounded by scattered papers and dim light, unaware that in just a few days his life would shift in a completely different direction. Not because he managed to fix everything, not because some miracle appeared, but because of one unexpected sentence from a young woman he never imagined would change anything in his life. Jordan's habit of staying late at the office slowly became routine, and it was during those exhausted hours that a special encounter began to form. The office was always quiet at night, no hurried footsteps, no familiar hum of the printer. It was just Jordan and the heaviness he tried to hide under the fading light. And then, for the first time, that silence was broken by the soft sound of a door opening. Ruby appeared in the doorway like a breath of fresh air, cutting through the heavy atmosphere around Jordan. She was about 23, youthful, with a bright face and her hair tied neatly behind her head, giving her a simple but striking look. Her clothes were plain, just dark workwear, yet there was something gentle about her presence. Ruby was the night janitor for the entire building, but what caught Jordan's attention was her calmness, a kind of quiet peace rarely seen in someone her age. Her eyes sparkled, yet carried a slight heaviness, as if she had lived through stories far beyond her years. The first time Jordan really noticed her was on a late night when he sat frozen in front of his open laptop, unable to focus on anything. The screen's glow washed over his tense face. Ruby walked in without making a sound, then switched on a small lamp in a far corner so she wouldn't bother him. Jordan looked up, a bit startled to see an unfamiliar face in a space he had always assumed belonged only to him at that hour. Ruby glanced at him, gave a small smile, and simply said, "Hey." Jordan replied with a quiet, "Hey," almost on instinct. That was all, but the moment stayed in his mind like a small marker, the first sign of someone whose presence he didn't yet realize he would keep encountering again and again. On the nights that followed, they started seeing each other more often. Ruby always greeted him first with a voice soft as a breath, not curious, not judgmental, making him feel like his presence didn't trouble her, and hers didn't trouble him. Sometimes she paused and asked a simple question. "You want the lights dimmer or brighter?" That small kind of consideration felt more comforting to Jordan than the complicated questions he usually got from clients and suppliers. The silence between them was never awkward. Every now and then, when Jordan looked especially worn out, Ruby glanced at him and said something direct but gentle. "You look tired." Not the kind of tired that sleep can fix. The words startled him. A young woman working late nights cleaning offices could read people with that much sensitivity. It made him notice her more, not in a romantic way, but in the way someone notices a sudden point of light inside their own darkness. Then one night, when the pressure had piled up past what he could hide, Jordan blurted out that his company was in trouble. He hadn't meant to open up. It was more like letting a little weight fall off his chest. Ruby didn't press him, didn't offer any cliché comfort. She simply tilted her head a bit and asked, "Are you trying to fix everything at once?" Her voice was soft, but the question hit the most fragile spot in his mind. Jordan looked at her, surprised by how she could be so direct, yet so gentle at the same time. From that moment on, Jordan started opening up more without even noticing. Not the kind of opening up with long emotional conversations, but the kind where he didn't feel the need to wear a mask when Ruby walked into the room. It also made him realize Ruby didn't fit the usual image people had of a young woman working night shifts. The calm way she observed everything made Jordan curious about the story behind those eyes that seemed older than her age. He didn't know why, but every time Ruby walked in, the heaviness in the room eased a little. It was as if she carried a quiet kind of peace into the space where he dragged himself night after night. And even though they only exchanged short lines, Jordan could feel that their encounters wouldn't stop at simple greetings. He didn't know what was coming, but he knew Ruby wasn't a random appearance. She was the beginning of something he didn't yet have a name for. The brief moments he shared with Ruby brought a gentle pause to his exhausting nights, but they had never changed anything in a real way. Everything shifted on one especially heavy evening, the kind where he felt like everything he had been trying to hold on to finally slipped out of his hands. That night, Jordan stayed in the office even later than usual. He opened his inbox with a thin thread of hope that his last remaining client would keep the contract, even though he had already braced himself for the worst. When the email appeared, the short line, "We have to cancel," hit him like a punch to the chest. No build-up, no detailed explanation, just a clean rejection strong enough to erase months of effort. Jordan sank into his chair. The office was dark except for the glow of the screen reflecting off his tense, pale face. The ventilation fan hummed above him, making the silence feel even heavier. He stared down at his hands, suddenly unsure of what to do next. Every direction felt blurred. Exhaustion crept into every breath. The door opened softly. Ruby stepped in, her cleaning cart making its usual faint clattering sound, but that night she stopped earlier than she normally did. One quick look at Jordan, and she knew something was wrong. Not because he looked tired. He had looked tired for weeks. It was the silence around him that was different. "Rough day?" Ruby asked, her voice quiet, but enough to cut through the thick air in the room. Jordan didn't answer right away. He took a deep breath, trying to organize his emotions, then realized he didn't have the strength to hide anything anymore. For the first time since they met, he spoke plainly, without circling around it, without holding back. "I might lose everything." Ruby didn't react with shock or pity. She stood still for a few seconds, watching him with calm eyes that weren't cold. It was as if she wasn't looking at his failure, but at the person trying to stand back up in front of her. Then Ruby said the one line that made everything in Jordan's mind come to a halt. "Losing money doesn't mean you're losing the game. It only means you're still playing." Her voice was gentle, but to Jordan it sounded like someone had switched on a light in the dark room he had been stuck in for far too long. He froze, almost holding his breath. A young woman, barely in her 20s, had spoken out loud something he had never fully understood, despite all his years of success, failure, confidence, and pride. Money didn't define who he was. Cancelled contracts didn't measure his worth. But he had spent so many years believing the opposite that when everything started to fall apart, he felt like he was collapsing with it. Jordan swallowed the tight lump in his throat. Ruby's words hit the deepest fear he had, the fear of losing his own worth just because he couldn't hold on to what he once had. It made him realize he had been letting money define him, and that was what had drained him all this time. Ruby watched him for another second, saying nothing more, no advice, no attempt to comfort him with empty lines. She simply went back to her work, wiping down a corner of the room as if their conversation had been just a small part of her night. That simplicity had a bigger impact than any long speech could have. Jordan stayed still, watching Ruby. For the first time in weeks, something different slipped into his mind. Not joy, not hope, but clarity. A small feeling, yet strong enough to remind him he could still get back up. All because of one sentence from someone he never expected to walk into the story of his life. Ruby's words were still echoing in Jordan's mind the next morning, like a quiet sound strong enough to shake the parts of him he had let go numb for too long. When he opened his eyes, the heaviness was still there, but it no longer pressed on his chest the way it used to. Instead, there was a different kind of calm, one that made Jordan wonder if he could start over. And for the first time in weeks, the answer wasn't completely no. Jordan got to the office earlier than usual. The morning light made everything look clearer, even the mistakes he had avoided facing. He reopened his old projects, going through every note, every sketch he had abandoned when things fell apart. The designs he used to be proud of reminded him why he started this work in the first place. After that, he opened his list of former clients, the ones who had trusted him before everything went downhill. Jordan took a deep breath, then began texting and calling them. He didn't beg. He was honest. He told them his studio was restructuring and that he hoped to work with them again if they still needed his services. Finally, he reviewed his operating costs and cut every non-essential expense. It wasn't easy, but it was a step he knew he had to take. That day, Jordan understood that if he wanted to move forward, he had to start from the same steps he once took. He reminded himself that his ego had made him overlook many small projects because he thought they weren't worthy of his skills. Now he knew he was no longer in a position to be selective. He called a small client he had once turned down because the project was too minor. The client was a bit surprised to hear from him, but happy that Jordan wanted to work together. Jordan also spent time reworking several designs himself instead of outsourcing them, carefully refining every line the way he did when he first entered the field. He realized it had been a long time since he had put his heart into each drawing like that. That night, when Ruby walked in, Jordan wasn't slumped over like before. He was adjusting a sketch so focused that he didn't hear the door open. Ruby looked at him, slightly surprised to see more life in him than usual. Jordan lifted his head and spoke first. "Ruby, why did you say that to me last night?" Ruby set the trash bag down, leaned lightly against her cart, and said slowly, "Because I've seen it before. My family lost everything when I was in high school." Jordan froze. He had never imagined there was a story like that behind her soft smile. Ruby continued, "I learned that money leaves fast, but people break even faster." Her words tightened something in Jordan's chest. They weren't just true. They came from something she had lived through, not from pretty phrases meant to comfort. He could feel the depth behind Ruby's slightly heavy eyes every time they crossed paths. Ruby didn't talk much, but the words she chose always landed on the exact spots Jordan tried to avoid. After a few quiet seconds, she added, "No one gets back up with one big jump. It's a bunch of small steps." Jordan let out a small smile, almost the first one in weeks. Ruby looked at him and said one last thing before turning away. "Progress is still progress, even when it's slow." Those words felt like a guide he hadn't known he needed. She didn't promise things would be easy. She didn't sugarcoat anything. But she made it clear that every step he was taking, no matter how small or invisible to others, was pulling him out of the darkest point in his life. And then, as if life was trying to hand him a small chance big enough to make him believe again, the small projects started coming back. A former client unexpectedly replied to his message and suggested working together again because they had always liked his style. Another one referred Jordan to a friend who needed a new meeting room design. They weren't big contracts, but they were enough to make Jordan feel his feet touching the ground instead of falling endlessly. Jordan didn't dare say everything was fine, but he knew he wasn't in free fall anymore. For the first time in months, he felt himself moving forward, slow but real. The small steps Jordan had been taking over the past few weeks helped him stand on solid ground again, but he knew that to truly recover, he needed an opportunity big enough to pull him forward. And it arrived on a morning that felt completely ordinary. While reviewing his task list for the day, Jordan received an email from a startup looking for a partner to redesign their entire new office space. This wasn't one of the tiny projects he had been doing just to keep cash flowing. This was a major contract, big enough to pull the studio away from the edge of shutting down. If he landed it, Jordan could pay off his debts, stabilize the company, and get a real chance to rebuild everything from scratch. But the arrival of that opportunity didn't bring the relief he expected. Instead, his old fears surged back stronger than ever. He read the email over and over, but couldn't bring himself to reply. He was scared of falling into the same cycle of failure again. Scared that no matter how hard he tried, things would eventually collapse anyway. That feeling slipped into every thought, leaving him uncertain about his next move. When Ruby walked into the office that night, Jordan was sitting in front of a blank design, spinning his stylus without drawing a single line. She didn't ask right away, but her eyes quickly caught the worry in him. She walked slowly toward him and asked gently, "You got news?" Jordan nodded and explained the big opportunity in front of him and the fear that came with it. Ruby watched him for a long moment, long enough for him to feel like she was seeing through every layer of defense he had built. Then Ruby said the line that stopped all his hesitation. "You can't rebuild your life if you're afraid of touching the pieces." The words were direct, not softening anything, but not harsh either. It felt like someone quietly placing a mirror in front of him, forcing him to face the truth. If he wanted to rebuild, he had to pick up the broken pieces. Even if they were sharp, even if they hurt, he couldn't stand at a distance and hope things would fix themselves. Jordan didn't answer right away, but when Ruby left the room, her words stayed with him, stronger than any motivation he had ever felt before. And after only a few quiet minutes, Jordan reopened the email, hit reply, and accepted the challenge. He threw himself into the work in a way he hadn't in months. Jordan built the mock-up himself, crafting every 3D angle as precisely as he could. He didn't sleep for 2 nights, drank water nonstop to stay awake, and poured every bit of effort into each detail. Not because he wanted to prove something, but because he wanted to truly rebuild his life, starting with this design. On presentation day, Jordan brought the model he had poured his whole heart into. He spoke slowly, confidently, and for the first time in months, his voice didn't shake when he talked about the future. The meeting was quiet, filled only with the sound of pages turning and keyboards clicking. When the presentation ended, the company's representative looked at him and simply said, "We'll contact you soon." A day later, the call came. The contract was signed. Jordan could barely believe his ears. It felt like someone had pulled him out of the water right before he went under for good. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling long and slow, the weight on his chest finally lifting. Right away, Jordan texted Ruby, "They chose my design. Thank you." Ruby's reply came a few seconds later, short and true to her style. "You did the work. I just reminded you who you were." Jordan read that line over and over. And in that moment, he understood that this comeback wasn't luck. It happened because he finally dared to look at the broken pieces and began putting them back together, bit by bit. Ruby was simply the person who helped him see the path he had forgotten how to walk. Landing that big contract didn't turn Jordan into a new person overnight, but it opened the door for him to truly start over. In the months that followed, he focused on completing the project with a clearer and more grounded mindset. As the workflow stabilized, he began hiring back a few former employees, but this time he built the studio in a smaller, steadier way. No more ambitions that grew too fast. No more pressure to look like someone successful. Jordan focused on doing each project well instead of chasing the image he once tried so hard to maintain. The studio came back quietly, but firmly. Jordan and Ruby's connection grew in a soft, natural way. Nothing romanticized, nothing stretched beyond reality. Just two people, each hurt in their own way, recognizing each other's value at the right moments. Ruby still worked the night shift in the building, still showed up with her familiar cart and gentle smile. Jordan didn't push the relationship in any direction, and Ruby didn't create any distance. Between them was a quiet, honest bond, like two parallel lines that happened to walk alongside each other for a short part of life, giving the other exactly what they needed. One evening after work, Jordan saw Ruby packing up her supplies to head home. He walked over and asked, unable to hide his curiosity, "Ruby, have you ever regretted doing this job?" Ruby looked up, her eyes bright under the dim light, and replied softly, "Every job matters when it lets you help someone." That line wrapped up the entire story in a way that felt almost perfect. Jordan understood right away that Ruby's worth had never been defined by the job she did, but by the way she saw the world, by her quiet kindness, by her ability to notice what others tried so hard to hide. He realized it was that calm strength that helped him stand back up, not in some dramatic way, but in the most authentic way possible. The message of his journey slowly settled in Jordan's mind. Money can be lost. Opportunities can disappear. But if a person holds on to who they are, stays patient, and keeps faith in themselves, they were never truly losing. One weekend night, as Jordan was cleaning up the studio before heading home, he happened to see Ruby walking out of the building. The warm yellow hallway lights outlined her small figure. Ruby turned back and gave him a small nod, a smile that could make an entire long day feel lighter. Jordan stood there, smiling back, not because he was successful again, but because he knew he had gotten back up, steadier, clearer, and more grateful. It all started with one sentence from someone he never expected would change his life. In the end, Jordan's story reminds us that sometimes a small reminder, coming from someone we least expect, has the power to pull us out of the lowest point in our lives. Not everyone needs a dramatic breakthrough. Often, just a different perspective is enough to help us move forward. And when a person holds on to their faith, patience, and kindness, they were never truly defeated. What do you think about the lesson Jordan learned? Has a small sentence from someone ever helped you change direction in your life? If you want to hear more stories that truly reach the heart, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next video. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story. See you again in the next inspiring chapter.